So we'll start here by opening a new file and saving it in a new location in our directory. So I'll go File, oops, File, New File. Oh, where's Python? File. Well, we'll just save it as a new text file. Let me see if I can save it as a Python extension. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to go into my desktop, my Python socket examples, and I'm going to create a new folder here now, and I'll call it 3, and we'll call it Basic GUI Chat Room. All right, perfect. And inside of here, I'm just going to save this file as Tkinter intro.py. So I'll put the .py extension. Okay, and that looks like it's working fine here for me. Awesome. So let me put a comment up at the top. We'll say Tkinter introduction. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to import the Tkinter library. So we'll say import Tkinter. Tkinter. Perfect. Okay, so now when working in Tkinter, you have to first define what we'll call a root window. You can think of a root window as your main window of your application that opens up when you run the application. Everything inside your application, all of the widgets, we'll call them, like buttons, scroll bars, entry fields, and even texts, are widgets that then live inside that root window. And so we can use my Visual Studio Code window here, for example. See, this main window is the root window, and all of these things that live inside of it, like this text field and these buttons over here, these are all widgets. And it's important to note that some of the widgets are grouped together, like these ones over here, right? These are all grouped maybe in some sort of vertical column, and then it looks like we have another group of widgets over here, like a kind of like a subframe, we'll call them. And so in Tkinter, you can group all of our widgets, our buttons or our entry fields or our text, together using different frames. So this is probably a frame here, and this is another frame over here. So the hierarchy, at least for us, for what we need to know, is that there is going to be a root window that holds specific frames, and those specific frames are going to hold all of our given widgets. All right, cool. So now that we have that like kind of basic understanding, let's make our root window. So we can do so by calling the TK class of the Tkinter library. So we're going to come over here and we're going to define our window. And so I'm going to call my window root. And so I'm going to call the Tkinter library or Tkinter module dot TK, capital T here. So we're calling the TK class, and that's going to create our root window for us. So now that we have this window, let's set some of the attributes of our root window. So first we can set a title of our window. So we can do root.title, and we'll just set a title here. We'll say let's chat. Right, we're trying to build a chat application. We can also put an icon for our window, right? You see, like, you know, Visual Studio Code has this icon right here, which is really kind of neat. We can add our own icons. Now, I'm just going to say that this works pretty flawlessly on Windows machines, but if you're on a Mac, I believe there are known issues with the icon. So if you're on a Mac, you might want to just skip this part. You're probably just going to have to result, to the default icon of the Mac operating system. So I'll have an icon available to you that you can download, but let me show you where I found it. It's a great resource called Icon Archive. My folder where I am running this script. So here's my Python socket examples, basic GUI chat room, and I will paste that in right here. So now, and I'm going to rename it just for ease. I'll call it Blue Talk. All right, so there's our Blue Talk icon file. So let's see how we would bring that icon file into our program now. Oh, I don't know what just happened there. Okay, we're back. We should be back now. Okay, so yep, we're good. So if I want to bring that icon file in, all I have to do is call my root window, and I'm going to call the attribute icon bitmap. And inside of here, I'm going to pass in the name of the icon. So because we have it in the same directory, I can just name the icon. So I'll say Blue Talk. And I'll put the extension .ico. I believe I'm going to need that extension here. Next, we can set the dimensions of our window, right? The size of our window. So we'll say root.geometry. We got to make sure we spell it right, geometry. And we'll set it as a string here. We pass in the dimensions 400 by 600. And then lastly, we can also say whether or not we want the window to be resized, right? So for like Visual Studio, I can resize my window if I want to. I can adjust it. But for some applications, we might not want to do that. So I'll show you how we can deny the user from doing that. So we'll call root, our root window, and we'll set the resizable attribute, and we'll set it to 0, 0. So that means you're not allowed to resize it in the horizontal direction, and you're not allowed to resize it in the vertical direction here. So with our window set, let's do a little more setup. I kind of like to do a bunch of setup here initially. I'm going to define some colors to use, and I'm going to pick 3 colors that we'll use throughout our application, and I'm going to define them using hex values. Essentially 3 hexadecimal values corresponding from 0 to like 255 for mixing of red, green, and blue color channels. So we'll say here we'll define colors. So I'm going to define a root color that we'll use, and I'm going to use the hex color. So we use the number sign or the pound sign to indicate that it's going to be a hex value. 53, 56, 57. We'll do input color, so I'll have a color for my like input frame. I'll eventually get to that. I'll do the pound sign. We'll do 4F, 64, and 6F, and then I'll do an output color, which is what we'll use for like our output frame or our area where we're outputting information to the screen. So we'll do DE, E7, E7. And so I like doing it this way because then if I want to mess around with the color themes, all I have to do is just come over here and just change the color here, and everything in the input frame should change appropriately. The last thing that we'll do in regards to color is I'm going to set a background color of my root window. So we'll say root.config. So I'm going to call the configuration or config attribute on our root window, and then inside here you can state what you want to configure. So I want to configure the background, so BG, and I'm going to set the background to be the root color that I had previously defined up here. All right, perfect. So now I'm just going to map out some comments here that are going to give us some space to define our functions and our GUI layout, which we'll do later on. So I'll say define functions, and then I'll say define GUI layout. But now what we have to do is a crucial part here. We actually have to start our window. So when we run our code, the Tkinter window that we created, the root window, right? We're calling it root here. It has a main loop method that essentially needs to be run. And it's this main loop method that opens the window and in turn creates all the frames and the widgets that we put inside of the root window until the user essentially closes it out. So let's call that main loop method. So we'll say run the root windows main loop. All right, so we'll just call it root.main loop. All right, and that should be it. And so now when we run this, we should see the window open up. So let's test this out. Hey, and there it is. So we have our Let's Chat application, which looks pretty nice. We have a nice background color here using the root.config. If I just change this, I don't know, I'll take the red. I think that's the red channel. I'll take the red channel out by putting 0 zeros in, and if we look, we get a completely different color. So you can tailor that to what you want. I'm going to go back to my my original grayish color right there. So I think this is a good place to stop. We've got a nice little setup here, and in our next video, we'll begin talking about what our GUI layout might look like for this introduction here to a chat app. All right, I'll see you in that next video. Hello and welcome back. With our root window complete, let's now add some frames to that root window. Frames are a great thing to use when you know that different regions of your application will be dedicated to different functionalities. In this case, I'm going to have an input frame that is going to hold some functionality of getting input from the user, and an output frame that will hold some functionality of displaying output to the user. I'm going to use frames so I can style, arrange, and manage the widgets of each frame differently and separately. So let's define some frames now in our layout section. So I'm going to scroll down here to where we have our comment for our GUI layout, and we can do so first by creating what's called a label frame object. When we create a Tkinter object other than a root window, we defined our root window way up here. This was the first object that we created. But anytime we create another object, we essentially have to attach it to something higher up in the creation hierarchy. We have to specify kind of where our object should go. And so here we're going to want our frame, what we'll call our label frame object, to go into the root window. So we have to attach it here. So let's see how we would do that. So I'm going to create a frame here. I'll call it input frame. And I'm going to set it equal to our Tkinter module, and then I'll create a label frame object. And the first thing that we'll give is where this, where this object should go. So we want it to go into the root window. So I'll specify root. We can also set some of the attributes of the object right here when we create it. So before, if you remember, we used the config option after, or the config method after we created the root window. We could set those options right in here as well. So a couple of different ways that we can do it. So let's set the background color of our frame right here. So I'll say in here, I'll say BG is equal to, we have a color defined for our input frame. It's going to be input color. Awesome. So that works out great. So let's do something similar for our output frame. So we'll say output frame is equal to tkinter.label frame. All right, where do we want this? Oh, you got to spell label right. There we go. Oh, that's still not right. There we go, label frame. Where do we want this frame to reside? We want it to reside in the root window, and we'll set an attribute of the background color to be our output color. All right, perfect. So essentially what we've just done here is we've created our frames, and maybe I'll put a little comment here. I'll say define frames. We've created the frames, but we haven't actually placed them inside of our application yet. See, we have to tell the frames where they should go. We know the frames know that they belong in the root window, but they don't know where in the root window they should go yet. And there's a few different ways to do this. So we'll really talk about two methods. The pack system and the grid system. And it's important to note that when you choose a placement system for some higher level container, you must use that system at all times. So you can't use both. For example, if we use the pack system inside of our root window with our frames, then everything that is inside of the root window directly must use the pack system. However, if we use the pack system on our frames, such that everything in our root window is using the pack system, we can then look inside of an individual frame, like the input frame. If we're going to put like widgets or buttons inside of this frame, well then inside of that frame we can use a different system, maybe like the grid system inside of one of our frames. And that's exactly what we're going to do, and that's going to allow us to sort of shape the layout of our application nicely here. So we'll use the pack system on our frames, and the pack system is really simple. It simply packs widgets onto the screen, starting at the top of the screen, and then it simply moves down sequentially, putting widgets one below the next. The grid system is a little bit more complicated, as it allows you to make a grid of space within a given region, with rows and columns placing widgets at specified locations within that grid. So for our frames, we really want simplicity, so we're just going to use pack. So let's pack the frames now and talk about some of our options here. So when we pack the input frame, for example, so I'm going to call input frame, and then I will call the .pack method. One of the things that we can do is we'll say, this is going to place it directly at the top of our root window, and we're probably going to want a little bit of spacing from the top, right? We don't want it right to the exact top of the window right up here. We want it maybe spaced down a little bit. So we can do so using something called padding. We can put padding in either the horizontal X or the vertical Y direction. So let's add a little bit of vertical padding here. So we'll say pad Y is equal to, we'll say 10. So if we run this now, let's see what happens. Our application looks exactly the same. We don't see the input frame that we supposedly packed onto the screen. And it's because the frame is set to only essentially be, by default, the frame is set to only be as big as it is needed. And because we currently don't have anything inside of this frame, it thinks it doesn't need to take up any space. So we'll rectify that in a moment here. Let's pack our output frame next. So our output frame will come down here and we'll say output frame.pack. And this time we'll put some horizontal padding. So I'll say pad x is equal to 10. And let's also put some vertical padding. But this time, let's only put our vertical padding at the bottom of our frame. Because what we're going to do is we've already got some vertical padding going at the top. See, when you do pad y is equal to 10, that does padding at the top of the widget and at the bottom of the widget. So at the top of the frame and the bottom of the frame, because those are both vertical. So we'll already have, if we're stacking these two frames on top of each other, we already have a padding of 10 above the output frame. So we only want to add some padding of 10 at the bottom of the output frame. So to do that, we can say pad y, and then we can specify a tuple where we set the top to be 0 and the bottom to be 10. Awesome. So that's going to work out quite nicely here. Now, if we want to see our frames or expand it into the root window without having anything inside of it, it's actually pretty easy. So first we have to bring in a keyword from Tkinter. So up here at the top where we say import Tkinter, from right at the bottom we're going to say from Tkinter import the keyword both, all capital letters. Now, some people will just import everything from the library. I mean, you could do that. I like to only import what I'm going to need. So I'll just import keywords and things as I need them here. So now that we have that, we will go back down and we will fill the frame, our output frame. We are going to fill the output frame in both the vertical and the horizontal direction. So we'll use that keyword both there. So that is going to expand our output frame vertically and horizontally, regardless of what's inside of it. And then in order to actually have this happen, we have to set one more attribute, expand. We have to set that to true, and so that will allow it to fill in that space. So now if we run this, we should see our output frame. So let's test this out. Hey, and there is our output frame. We've got 10, a padding of 10 on the horizontal axis on both sides. We got a padding of 10 in the vertical on the bottom, and then we have another frame that's up top, our input frame. We haven't yet expanded it yet because we're going to add some widgets into it, and we'll see that when we add our widgets, that will begin to expand. So let's put some widgets into our frame now. So I'll come down over here. We'll say define widgets. Okay, perfect. So the first thing that we'll do is we're going to start with our input frame, so we can hopefully see that frame expand, and we're going to put in a text entry so a user can essentially type in a message, and then a button so that they can submit the message. Kind of something that you definitely need in a chat application. So to create a text entry, we will use the entry class. And now we said that, so let's actually define that. We'll say message entry is equal to tkinter.entry, so the entry class. And we said that anytime you create an object, you have to attach it to something in the the container hierarchy, right? Like our frames were attached to the root window. Well, where do we want this entry object to be attached? Not necessarily to the root window, right? This is going to instead be connected into one of our frames. So we're going to connect it into our input frame. So we'll say here input frame. That's where we'll specify it needs to go. All right, perfect. And so now let's actually set some of the attributes of this text entry. So we can specify a text that the thing might prompt. So we'll say text is equal to enter a message, and we can specify a width, and I'll just set a width of 30. And a lot of times, you have to mess around with these numbers to get them to be what you want it to be. I kind of have already done that for us, so we don't need to do that. Let's also create a button object next. So we're going to create a button that we can use to signify like sending our message. So we'll call this send button, and I'll set it equal to tkinter.button. And where are we going to place this button? Well, we're going to place it in the input frame. and we'll give the button a text value of send, right? We'll just say send. Simple. So now that we've made our widgets, we actually have to go ahead and place them into the frame. Just like before, right? We made our frames, but that didn't do anything until we placed them into the root window. We made our widgets, now we have to place them into the input frame. And if you recall, we used the pack method when we were placing things, right? We used pack when placing things into the root window. Well, we can choose a new sort of system here when placing things into the input frame. And we're going to do just that. We are going to use the grid system to place these widgets where we want them. So when we use the grid system, you have to specify the row and column of where the widgets should go. However, be careful. It's not as intuitive as you would think. The rows and columns are not going to be equally spaced, but rather their size is defined by the views or widgets that are inside of them. So if you specify column 4, but column 2 and 3 have nothing in it, then column 4 is going to essentially be right next to column 1. So it's a difficult thing to sort of wrap your head around initially. So let's work through it. So let's place our widgets using the grid system. So I'm going to place my message entry. So I'll do message entry.grid, and I'm going to place this in row 0, column 0. So that'll be like row 0, column 0 will be the top left corner of this frame. And then I'm going to add some padding. So I'll say pad X is equal to 10 in the horizontal direction, and pad Y is 10 in the vertical direction. So we'll do horizontal and vertical padding. And so then let's do our send button. So I'll do send button.grid. Now here, I want the message entry to appear and then the button to be right to the right of it. So I want them in the same row. So I'll do row 0, but in a different column now, right? If I put it in column 0, these widgets are going to be one on top of the other. I don't want that. So column 1 will be directly to the right of our message entry. And let's also set some padding here. So we'll do pad X is 10, pad Y, pad Y is 10, and then we can add what is called internal padding. So let's actually just run this now and see what this looks like. Let me get rid of that comma. So if we run this, we should see those widgets. Oh, I have an error. Bad. Oh, I spelled column wrong on one of these. Yep, column. There we go. Let's try this now. All right, perfect. So there are I can type in a message here, and then I have this send button. But one of the things that we might want to do is we might want to put some space inside of this widget to add more space around the word send. You can see the button is only as big as it needs to be, okay? So, and the frame is only as big as it needs to be, right? So that's kind of a reoccurring theme here. So what we can do is we can specify, hey, let's add some spacing inside of the button around the word send. So like some internal padding in the X and Y direction. It'll make our button bigger, and in turn it should make the frame bigger. So let's see how we would do that. So on my button here where we're calling the grid method, we're going to add, at the end, we'll add some internal padding, or iPad X. We'll set that to 10, we'll set that to 20, and then I'll do iPad Y, and I'll set it equal to 5. So that should make our button significantly bigger. So if we check this out now, there we have it, right? Our button is taking up more space, and I think our frame has grown to accommodate that as well. So this is working pretty nicely. All right, so in our next video, maybe we'll talk about, hey, what kind of functionality can we use when we actually press this button? So I will begin seeing you, or I'll see you in that next video. Hello and welcome back. In our last video, we built our frames and put them into the root window and then began looking at populating those frames with some widgets. So I'd like to continue with that. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep working, I think, in the input frame, and we're going to add a new widget called a radio button, which will allow us to select some options, maybe like the color of the text that we want to use when we display our messages in our chat room. So a radio button is a set of selectable buttons that are linked together through the same variable. When a specific button is selected, we can then get the value of the linked variable and use it to do things like update the color of our text. And these linked variables, they can be strings or integers. We just have to be careful to specify what type of variable we are going to use. So let's create a variable, and we'll to hold the text color that we want, and we'll use a string variable for this. So we have to declare this as a string variable, and in order to do that, we have to bring in the string var class from Tkinter. So up here at the top where I imported the keyword both, I'm now going to import string var. And that's going to allow us to use the string variable class. So if I come back down here under where I'm defining my widgets, I'm going to create a new variable. We'll call it text color, we'll call it, and we'll just declare it as a string variable. And that's going to allow our radio buttons to reference that variable as a string and then get the value of that variable. Okay, perfect. So now what we'll do is let's make 3 radio button widgets that are going to allow us to essentially change the text of our message that we send. We'll change the color to either like red, green, or blue. Okay, and we're going to link all 3 of these radio buttons through our string variable text color that we just created. So we're going to use the radio button class, and so let's see how we're going to do this. So we'll just do the red button first. So we'll have a red button, and I'll call tkinter.radio button. Now, if you remember, the first thing that we have to do is we have to attach this to some object that's higher up in the hierarchy. We want these radio buttons to be in our input frame because it's going to be in regards to the user inputting information. I'll have a text attribute that I can set, so I'll have the word red here. I'm going to link a variable to this radio button. The variable that I want to link is the text color variable that I've defined right here. So we'll say text color. I can specify a value that I want that variable to take whenever this radio button is selected. So I'm going to do value, and if this is a string variable, well then that value should be a string. And what we're going to put in here is we're going to put a hexadecimal color, just like we did up here when we defined our root, input, and output colors. So I want this color to be red, so the hex value for red is FF. I can do it. FF0000. So essentially this is all of the red channel, none of the green channel, and then none of the blue channel for 00. And then why don't we also set the background color of the button to be, so BG, we'll set it to be the same color as the input frame, because that'll look nice. It'll look like they just kind of like blend in nicely here. Otherwise we might get like a white color, and we'll look at that in a moment here. Okay, perfect. So that's kind of like how we're going to define one of our radio buttons. So now what we should probably do is let's do something similar for our other 2 colors. So really, I can probably just copy this whole line. I'll paste and change red to green, red to blue. Let's think about what else we have to change. The text, we want this to say green, and we want this text to say blue. The variable is still going to be linked. They're all going to be linked to the same variable, our text color string variable, but I do need to change the hex values of these colors. So green is going to be FF here, and then blue will be FF over here. All right, perfect. So we've created the radio buttons. Of course, if we run this, we're not going to see them yet, right? We shouldn't, at least, because, oh, we have an error. Unknown color, where's the line? Line 35. Line 35, I have an error. Oh, I know why, because I'm calling it input frame. The color that we defined is input color. I have to make sure I change that. Sorry about that. I got confused. So nice little thing. I don't know if you're working here. You can, I think you can click, if in Visual Studio you can click and hold Alt, and so now if I hold Alt while I click, I can have multiple cursors, so I can just change this to color. Okay, so now if I run that, hopefully that error is going to go away, and it does. But of course we don't see our radio buttons yet because we have to place them into the input frame. We haven't yet done that, and so we are sort of locked into using the grid system on the input frame because we've already used the grid system on the input frame right here. So everything for the input frame has to use the grid system, which isn't too bad. That's going to work out kind of nicely. We're just going to place essentially these 3 radio buttons. I want them in a row right below our input message. So I want them right below here. So let's try this. So let's see what's going to happen here. So I'm going to say red button dot grid. So we'll call the grid system on the red button, and we'll specify row 1 now, our next row down, and column 0. So let's see if the red radio button appears. Hey, and there it is. It appears right there. So that looks pretty good. Let's just see if I had gotten rid of the background color, right? If we didn't specify this color, let me cut this, and we run this now. What's it going to look like? Oh, see, it's going to have like a default like grayish white color, and we don't want that. So we want it to blend in. Let me paste that back in. Okay, perfect. So we definitely want that background color there. So now let's place our next button. So our next button will be the green button dot grid. And here you would say, okay, we want to be in the same row, but now I want to be in the next column. So column 1. And you might say, okay, let's do the next button, blue button dot grid. And you'd say, okay, I want to be in row 1, column 2. Perfect. So this looks like it should make sense. So let's run this and see what happens. Okay, so it is definitely not what we want, okay? Something weird happens. And so let's talk about what's happening. Here, we placed our red button, and I'll scroll down so we can see this. We placed our red button in column 0, and column 0's width is defined by the largest element in column 0, and that largest element is the this input frame here. Column 1 is then defined by the next, its largest element, and that's going to be the send button. And then column 2 is all by itself, right? We had nothing in column 2 in this first row, so column 2 then gets pushed to the side. And this looks pretty bad. I think it would look nicer, really, if all 3 of these radio buttons were centered under the input field here. So let's see how we might actually do this. It's not too bad, I think. So if we go to our message entry widget, so here's our message entry widget. What we really want is this widget's length to define essentially the first 3 columns in the row. All right. So if we think about it, I'm going to run this again just so we're clear. I want this width to define the first 3 columns in the row, so that then I can place my red button in the first column, second column, and third column, and they'll all be in the width of this entry field. So we most certainly can do that. So let's think about how we're going to do this. We're going to use what is known as a column span attribute. So we can tell the widget, if we look here under message entry grid, where we say row 0, column 0, we can say, hey, we want your width to span 3 individual columns. So I'll say column span is equal to 3. Okay, perfect. So now its length is going to define columns 0, 1, and 2. So if we think about that, what we now need to do, since columns 0, 1, and 2 are being defined here with our message entry, we have to move our send button into essentially column number 4. Column number 3, I'm sorry, right? 0, 1, and 2 are defined by our message entry, so now we have to move this into column 3. All right, perfect. So let's check. Let's run this. And now all 3 of our buttons are lined up really nicely here. So this is great. Let's do some spanning with our send button too. I'd really like the send button to take up 2 whole rows so that this space is filled in. So I'm going to come to my send button, and where we're using the grid system here, instead of using column span, what I will do is I want it to fill up 2 rows. So I'm going to do row span is equal to 2. All right, so that should work kind of nicely here. So if we run this, it sort of centers it in our space here. So that looks pretty good. Lastly here, if you notice, all three of our buttons are kind of selected right when we start, and I don't want that. I definitely don't want that. So what we should do is we should set the value of our variable, that string variable text color, upon the start of the app so that only one of these is selected by default. So we can do that if we just come back over here. We're going to, right here where we defined our text color string variable, we'll now say text color, that variable, dot set, and we'll set it to one of our values. Let's set it to, I don't know, we'll set it to the red value, which is going to be FF0000. All right, 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. If we run this now, we should see, hopefully, just the red button is selected. And you can see I can click, and they are only selecting one at a time because they are all linked to that same string variable. All right, this is great. Lastly, let's just talk about what widgets might we put in our output frame here. And so I think in our output frame, it's going to show all of the messages that have been recorded in this like really kind of just intro chat app here. So what we'll do is we'll put a text label right at the top that just says messages, and then we'll list or stack each message below this label, one below the next, which means our output frame is going to be really perfect for that pack system of managing where our widgets go. So let's come down here. So we're still defining widgets, and now we'll work on the output frame. So I'm going to create a label. I'll call it output label. And so we'll call tkinter.label. To display just plain text, we'll use a label object. We have to say where this object is going to go. Well, this object is going to go not in the input frame, but this time it's going to go in the output frame. We'll have the text say something like, I'll use 3 tags, and then I'll say stored messages, and then 3 more tags, something like that. And then we can set the color and the font. So let's set some font options of this label. To set the text color, instead of using the background attribute, we'll use the foreground attribute, FG, and I'll set the foreground to be our input color. So the text of this label will be the color of the input frame, and then the background color I'll set to be our output color that we had previously defined. And then lastly, I can define the font that I want to use, and that's going to be a tuple where the first is the font name. So I'll use Helvetica Bold, and then the next value is the size of the font. So I'll use an integer here of 18. All right, so that creates the label, and so the last thing that we need to do is put that label into our output frame. And so because I'm on a new frame, I no longer have to follow the grid system. I can choose whatever system I want, and I'm going to use the pack system. So I'll do output label.pack, and I'm just going to give some vertical padding here of, we'll just say an arbitrary value of 15. All right, so if we run this now, our layout is going to be complete. And there it is. There's our completed layout for this, like, you know, kind of introduction to Tkinter. I have my input frame where I can type some messages. This is cool. I will eventually, hopefully, be able to have some functionality with these radio buttons, send that message, and then that message should hopefully appear in our output frame under our stored messages lists. I think this is a great place to stop here. In the next video, we'll begin to look at how we program some of this functionality. And so I will see you in that next video. Hello and welcome back. Now that we have our layout complete, we want the user to be able to enter some message here and then click the send button and actually store that message and display it in our output section. So let's write a function that's going to allow us to do just that. So I think we reserve some space for functions in our program here, right? So we've got this define functions here, right here at the top. So let's write out our function here. So we're going to define a function called send message. So we'll say def send message. And well, the first thing that we'll do is we'll put a little doc string in here just quickly describing the function. So we'll say send the user's message to the output frame. Okay, perfect. Now, here, what we're going to do is anytime we want to send a message, we're going to have to create a new label object based on what the user has typed into our text entry. So remember, label objects, we made one down here. They're simply used to just display text, and that's exactly what we want to do. We want to display some text in the output frame. So we're going to create a new label object. So I'll say message label is equal to tkinter dot label. And now we have to think about where we want this label object to be placed. Well, we want it to be placed in the output frame, right? It's going to be placed in the output frame where we're storing all of our stored messages. So we'll say output frame. And now we got to think about, what do we want the text of this label to say? Well, the text is going to be whatever the user put into the message and entry object here, right? Whatever they typed in, we want to get that text and put it as the text to our label. So we can do that by saying text equals, we'll call our message entry widget, and we'll call the .get method. All right, perfect. So now let's actually just format this a little bit. Let's set a foreground color. The foreground color of the text, or the font color, will be whatever the user has selected from our radio buttons, right? So the font color is either going to be red, green, or blue, depending on what radio button the user has selected. So in order to do that, we can access that through our text color variable. So every time we click a new radio button, the value of our text color variable is going to change. So let's get the value of that text color variable. So the font color, or foreground, will be text color.get. The background color is simply going to be the color that we have defined for the output color. So we'll do background as output color, and then we'll set the font here to be in a tuple. We'll say Helvetica, and we'll say size 12. Okay, so I think that's going to define our label here that we just created. All right, that looks great. And so now what we need to do is we need to place this into the output frame. So we'll say message label dot, we'll say dot pack, right? Because we're using the pack system for this. So, right, we're using the pack system for the output frame. So if I run this and I type in my message, this is my message, and I'll select blue, and I click send, nothing's happening. And it's because what we haven't done, we haven't linked our button to this function. So we have to somehow like say, hey, anytime the button is pressed, we want to run our send message function. And we can do that. So we're going to go down to our send button here. Here's our send button. And we have to just add a command attribute. So we'll say command is equal to, and now we type in the name of the function that we want to link to our button. So our function name is send message. Notice we're not going to put parentheses here because we're not calling the function. We're just going to link it here. All right, so let's test this now. So if I run this, hello world, and it should be red, and that's red. And so now I'm going to type in goodbye world, and let's do green. It should be green. Hey, awesome. And then we'll say see you later, and let's try blue. All right, so everything is working kind of nicely here in this little, introductory app. A few things that we can definitely improve on. So when I enter a message, I'd really like the text box to clear after I hit send, so I don't have to manually delete my my box, manually delete it. And maybe there's a couple other like formatting things we can just quickly change here to wrap this up. So let's talk about auto clearing our message. We can definitely do that, and we can do that using the delete method of our entry box. So I'm going to come up here in our send message function. Anytime the user hits the button, we've linked this function. So we're going to create a message label. We're going to pack it to the screen, and then I'll say clear the entry field for the next message. So our entry is message entry dot delete. I'll call the delete method. And so here we have to specify what indices of the strings to delete. So we'll always start right at the beginning of our string in the message entry. So that's going to be where'd my cursor go? That's going to be at index 0. But then how far do we have to go? Well, we want to go all the way to the end of the string, and the string's end is going to change, depending on the size of the string. Luckily for us, there's an end keyword that we can use to specify, hey, go all the way to the end of the string. We just have to make sure we come up here and we import that keyword. So we'll say end. All right, perfect. So now that's going to clear the text quite nicely here. This little bit right here. Let's just wrap this up with a few more tweaks that are kind of unnecessary, but I think they're just going to make things look a little nicer. So first, let's change the background color of our send button to match the color of the output frame. So I'm going to scroll down here to my send button, and I will put this. I'll say BG is equal to output color. All right, so now that will change the background color of our send button, and I think it's just going to give a nicer theme. And then lastly, let's change the font of our input text so it's a little easier to read. So right now, right, that entry is a little it's a little small. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So we're going to come over to our message entry widget. So here's our message entry widget, and I am going to add a font, and I'll set the font equal to Helvetica, and we'll change the size to be a size 12. Okay, we're gonna also adjust the width here. I think we'll change it from 30. Let's adjust the width to 25, and that'll just make things a little bit better for us. And then the last thing that I think we can do is we can update the font of our output labels that we're creating to maybe be a little larger as well. Or we already did that, right? We already set the font. Yeah, we set that font. So let's run this now. With those few changes, let's take a look. So now we can say this is easier to read. Perfect. That's being stored. I can send it in as green and as blue, and we can begin to fill up our chat window. So, you know, this is a great place to stop. I think everything's working pretty nicely. And this is a real quick introduction to Tkinter, but now that you've seen some of the things that we're going to apply in the next few videos, we can leverage this library to really help us build our own chat room application and then move forward with our sockets and threading modules. So soon enough, what we'll have is a nice GUI chat client that we can, that'll bring you back to the golden days of like AOL chat rooms. I do think it's beneficial for us to kind of see it first here, so I kind of introduce the concepts, and then we'll use them in our project coming up, starting in our next video. So I will see you then.